Vocea rațiunii, colonelul Douglas Macgregor, invitat la Redacted. Haideți să savurăm treaba împreună. Go!
Did a failed coup attempt in Russia over the weekend reveal about the war in Ukraine, about Western intentions, about Western media bias, and the like? For that, I want to bring in Colonel Douglas Macgregor to get an after-action report, if you will, of
suntem amândoi pe roz. Bravo!
this crazy weekend that we had. Colonel, it's good to see you here on such a big
Nu și colonelul Douglas Macgregor.
news week and a big news story. Good to see you.
Absolutely.
So first I want to put up these live maps. These are, I think, really helpful for our audience who might not be familiar of what this contested territory is. The area that has voted, of course, to become part of Russia, the Donbass, what was eastern Ukraine. Here's the Russian live battle map. And you can see the line here. And
da, deci multora încă le scapă acest aspect. Luptele se duc pe niște teritorii care au votat deja cu învingătorul. Ok? Deci, practic, putem spune că ăsta este un război de apărare pe care Rusia îl duce împotriva vestului colectiv. Pentru că Ucraina nu ar fi rezistat atâta timp dacă vestul colectiv nu ar fi pompat finanțare și arme în Ucraina, da? Și chestia asta va continua și tot va continua până când, la un moment dat, vestul colectiv, Occidentul, NATO, Uniunea Europeană, luați-o cum vreți, se va plictisi și va opri această sângeroasă șaradă.
then looks a little different than the Ukraine live battle map, so that no one can accuse us of bias here. These are the two different maps, one from the Russian side, one from the Ukrainian side of these live view maps of the battle right now. And over the weekend, the New York Times basically said, well, this didn't change the war at all. In fact, the West was, Ukraine failed to exploit this coup this weekend, that there was nothing they could do.
Tentativă de lovitură de stat, de fapt a fost mai degrabă un protest făcut într-adevăr de niște oameni foarte bine înarmați, da?
Failed to exploit this massive coup, which was a kind of a crazy admission from the New York Times. But just based on those battle lines, what is your assessment of where things stand right now after this coup this weekend?
If you look at the Russian map, you'll see that there are advances on the northeast side. If you just sort of regard the area under Russian control as a large banana that sort of...
Ok, nu m-am gândit până acum la comparația asta, da? Teritoriile ocupate de ruși în Ucraina au formă de banana.
Runs in that form. The Russians have made progress towards Kharkov. These have been limited offensives, I think, to gain control of road nets and terrain that will facilitate a rapid offensive, which is to follow. There have been other areas where there have been some...
Da, nu v-a scăpat informația. Colonelul Douglas Macgregor crede că urmează o ofensivă masivă a Federației Ruse.
Advances as well. The Ukrainians don't show as much of that for obvious reasons. The Ukrainian forces are, in fact, on the verge of collapse. They are totally demoralized. They've experienced large numbers of desertions to the Russian side and from the battlefield.
Iauzi, deci înainte de clipul ăsta m-am uitat la Scott Ritter, invitat tot la Redacted. Colonelul Douglas Macgregor este mai pesimist, da? Țineți cont că el nu este cu rușii, da? Și crede că urmează o întorsătură de situație masivă pe câmpul de luptă, da? Adică inițiativa va trece de partea rușilor.
General. People are going out of their way to avoid military service of any kind in Ukraine. So the Zelensky regime is in a lot of trouble.
Da, îl întrerup, scuze încă o dată. Ucraina a declanșat încă o campanie de mobilizare, de recrutare, de chemare la arme, de prins oamenii pe stradă, prin magazine, restaurante, discoteci, whatever, cu arcanul, cum spunem noi românii.
Well, we need to talk about that because to some extent that explains why Prigozhin behaved the way he did.
Încă o dată observăm că YouTube nu a indexat numele lui Prigozhin și îl traduce mereu ca pișatul boului, practic. Fragosian, ce-o fi asta? Împrăștia.
And if you want to go there, we can go there now, or we can continue to gaze at the map.
No, I just wanted to kind of put in context when I think people don't often understand that this portion of former Eastern Ukraine is now Russia and voted overwhelmingly to become part of Russia. And this is the area where there's sort of a tit for tat back and forth right now along this line. And this is the area where the Wagner forces were positioned, right? This was...
Yes.
And so Prigozhin then, of course...
Progosian. Bă, Prigozhin, YouTube, fă și tu un update, fă ceva.
Moves and makes this move over the weekend. Let's dive into exactly why he would have done this given this timeline. What's your assessment of that?
Well, Prigozhin is a complex figure. Certain things need to be understood up front about him and Wagner. First, Americans need to understand that the Wagner group is really very analogous to the French Foreign Legion. If you're looking for an entity in the history of the French Republic that has fought harder than anyone else for France in both World Wars.
Adevărul că ăștia doi sunt amuzanți, însă totuși presupun că au ceva experiență de luptă și nu i-aș lua în derâdere chiar așa ușor, da? Între ăsta și Radu Hosu, eu aș pune pariu pe băiatul ăsta, în sensul că el va supraviețui confruntării.
Wars and between the wars all over the world, it's the French Foreign Legion. I would say that you could say the same thing about the Wagner group. Whatever their origins, and they're certainly a creature to some extent of Russian intelligence for use overseas, but they have fought in this war tirelessly to advance the Russian cause, and they've taken the casualties to prove it. So they are enormously popular with the Russian people. The Russian people.
Observați, nu știu câți dintre voi v-ați uitat la clipul precedent cu Scott Ritter, care spunea că rușii nu-i prea iubesc pe Wagner și nici pe Prigozhin și că aplauzele de la Rostov-pe-Don au fost doar la secvența în care aceștia au părăsit orașul și s-au întors la bazele lor. Se pare că Macgregor are altă părere care coincide cu părerea mea. Da, rușii sunt atașați și de gruparea Wagner.
People love Wagner, and the Russian people overwhelmingly like Prigozhin. Prigozhin's kind of an
Nu știu, aici nu știu ce să spun. Prigozhin ăsta pare un fel de Becali al Rusiei, păstrând desigur proporțiile.
Attractive character to us in the West. He's very foul. He makes outrageous statements. He exaggerates, and he is
Da, audiența știe să atragă. Șoc, șoc, șoc. Iar a spus Prigozhin o chestie. Iar s-a filmat Prigozhin cu, știți voi ce în spate, ca să nu spun eu pe YouTube, da?
Exaggerated his own importance on more than one occasion. He is not a.
Dar a fost foarte simpatic când s-a filmat în fabrica aia de băuturi alcoolice, nu știu ce erau alea, vinuri spumante sau ceva, și erau toate neatinse la locul lor și a arătat o sticlă spartă și a spus: nu e vina noastră, nu e vina noastră, așa am găsit-o, da? O predăm pe inventar așa cum am găsit-o. Efectiv, nu-ți vine să crezi când te gândești că cine sunt ăia care au ocupat fabrica de băuturi alcoolice? Ruși. Și n-poftim. Deci există ceva disciplină și în rândul Wagnerilor.
Professional soldier, but he is seen as a voice that the Russian people strongly support because of his ferocious determination to fight and win this war. And I think it has to be understood that the Russian people, large numbers of people in the Russian military establishment, are very frustrated with Putin's exercise of considerable restraint. We in the West don't seem to understand that Putin has moved very cautiously.
Este reținut în manevrele lui, el este cu operațiunea militară specială, adică cu mare grijă, chirurgical, să încercăm pe cât posibil, desigur, să nu afectăm populația civilă și sunt unii pe lângă el care ar vrea o abordare mai în forță, da, a situației.
And deliberately throughout this war,
Ceea ce pe undeva ar avea avantajul că ar termina Daravela mai repede și am putea să ne întoarcem și noi la treburile noastre zilnice. De exemplu, să râdem de USR.
he doesn't want to provoke NATO intervention. He wants to avoid a war with the United States. And as a result, each of the gains that the Russians have made have been quite limited and incremental. And people are fed up with it. You've got a number of senior officers in the Russian military who don't like it. So when you look at the problems that Prigozhin has had with the Russian high command, he's been angry because he said he didn't get enough ammunition, angry because he didn't think his soldiers were being adequately supported. Eventually,
Muniție, muniție, mai vreau muniție, mi se dă muniție pe spongi, hai cu muniția odată, haide.
Putin intervened. General Surovikin was told, look, you've got to manage this. They're very good troops. Make sure he gets what he needs. And Surovikin is very sympathetic to Prigozhin and his larger views, I think. But Prigozhin decided...
Surovikin, generalul Armageddon, spune Douglas Macgregor că ar fi un simpatizant al lui Prigozhin. E posibil, tot ce e posibil.
It wasn't working and it wasn't enough.
Că nu degeaba este denumit generalul Armageddon, nu?
And I also think
Probabil că are aceleași vederi radicale ca și Prigozhin. Gata, nu mai întrerup.
he knows he's not a professional soldier, so his ability beyond speaking publicly is limited. And I think he decided, I've got to get President Putin's attention. He needs to understand that the senior ranks need to be shaken up, that we need people with fire in the belly who want to go forward and crush the Ukrainians and be done with it. And so I think he went down to Rostov, where of course there was no fighting. If you look at the shots that were made of his discussion in the
Da, e adevărată chestia asta, poate un pic exagerat termenul de a ocupat un oraș de 1 milion de locuitori cu câteva mii de muzicieni. E ciudat. Nu, de fapt ei și-au parcat vehiculele în fața unor instituții. Asta s-a întâmplat în fapt.
Guard with the deputy chief of staff of the Russian general staff, they were very amicable. And I think these few troops that he sent towards Moscow were not headed there to
Estimarea ar fi că a trimis spre Moscova între 1500 și 2000 de Wagneri. Deci nu foarte mulți. Cum vă spuneam, era mai mult un protest.
Place Putin at all. They were there to try and get his attention, deliver the message that we want to fight, we want to end this war, and we want better leadership from the military, not from President Putin. Well, this whole thing got out of control. It looked like something it wasn't. The West celebrated, thinking, oh, finally, somebody's standing up to the evil Putin. It's a lot of nonsense. They're all very supportive of President Putin. And when it became clear what had happened, Lukashenko, who has known Prigozhin for at least 20 years, talked to President Putin, who also knows Prigozhin. He understands what we've discussed. President Putin was furious. He mobilized 30,000 troops in Moscow. He was ready to go down and crush all of this. When the Russian troops that had gone up there from Wagner, or the Wagner Foreign Legion, if you will, put its arms down immediately because they didn't want to kill Russians. The Russians don't want to kill them. So it all kind of fizzled quickly, as most of us thought that it would. But this is not somebody that you simply stand up against the wall and shoot. This is someone who is popular in Russia. He expresses a point of view that's not necessarily anti-Putin at all, but is very definitely sympathetic to the larger cause of let's end this war and get rid of these fascists that are sitting in Kiev. And so you're not...
Ce face băiatul ăsta cumva? Photobombing sau care este expresia aia în spatele lui Prigozhin?
Not going to shoot him. Lukashenko says, look, let me bring him up to Belarus. I'll keep him under wraps till this thing is over. And I think that's effectively what's happened. Everybody has effectively been pardoned. Nobody's going back to prison. Nobody's going to be executed at this stage. Now, I do think that the Wagner group will see some of its forces broken up, not disbanded, but in smaller bites. 5,000, 4,000 troops moved into other areas in the future. And remember that this insistence by Prigozhin that they had been attacked.
Pagosianului. Aoleu, am apăsat pe
Totally
mute.
wrong. It never happened. That was his pretext to get people to react the way they did. So it's all over. But I do think that President Putin got the message. And I would look for some shakeups in the near future in the Russian high command. And I would be very surprised if we do not see an offensive begin soon. Because frankly, there's nothing out there to stand up to the Russian offensive. And remember,
Mai ales că acum cam au supremația aeriană, da? Practic ei pe timpul contraofensivei ucrainene au testat chestia asta și cumva au dovedit-o, da? Sunt stăpânii aerului de deasupra câmpului de luptă.
the Russians have never, ever unleashed the full might of their force.
Putin cel reținut.
Right.
This has been a limited war from the beginning because Putin wants to live with Ukrainians after this is over.
Corect.
He's not interested in killing large numbers of people. What he wants is neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine.
Cum sună asta? Pentru ce mai rămâne din Ucraina?
That's his goal. That's his overriding interest. So I think we're going to see some things change. I don't know what they'll be. I don't know who will go, who will stay. It won't happen all at once, but something will change up there. And then we'll see this offensive. And, you know, just imagine you're a Russian soldier in one of these defensive positions. You've trained to fight. You've trained to attack. And you're saying, look, this is ridiculous. Look what we've done to these people. We've slaughtered them. Let's get this over with. I don't want to be here in another year. And I mean, I felt that way in 1991 when Colin Powell and others were saying, well, perhaps we should just go to a Korean-style frozen conflict, build a new DMZ between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Well, I was horrified. Large numbers of the generals thought, oh, well, this is good, then we don't have to fight. But the
Ce înseamnă să vorbești din experiență?
soldiers, we were furious. So let's get this over with, be done with it. Fortunately, that's what happened. And President Bush, to his credit, said, no, we're going to attack. And we did. I think there's similar feelings now on the Russian side.
So a couple of things there. So this really, I mean, Putin seemed like he was pissed. And he mentioned multiple times in that speech, this is treason, this is mutiny, this is a betrayal. Betrayal, he said a number of times. So it doesn't seem like Putin's the kind of guy to do what others ask him to do, but you say he seems to get the message here. He probably got the message here. I mean, he goes up and he's now with Lukashenko. He'll be pardoned. Doesn't look like any of these people are going to be prosecuted. And it's all sort of well, it was a rough weekend. We had a family dispute. Uncle Larry got a little drunk and it got a little feisty. And that's really what this was. I mean, is at the end of the day, this is how they're going to handle this?
Mișto făcută analogia. Bravo.
Well, look at this from the vantage point of mafia disputes.
Mm-hmm.
The five families got into a dispute, but everyone decided very quickly we don't want a war.
Mm-hmm.
The war will be, destructive and self-defeating, and so the bosses backed off, and the big boss said, "All right, back off, get back to work, behave yourselves, and you can survive." Remember, Putin right now.
Mi se pare mie sau tocmai l-a comparat pe Putin cu capul unei familii mafiote?
It's much more like the Tsar. And Tsars have had trouble with people before.
L-a făcut țar repede. Hai mă, mafia boss.
I could go back to a long way and find this with Alexander II, Alexander III, Nicholas I. They all had disputes. There were from time to time irascible generals who wanted to take sterner action than the Tsar was prepared to take. In most cases, these people were not harmed. They were not in prison. They were not jailed. They were sent away and told to shut up and color for a while, but they were not
Shut up and color for a while? Cum adică taci și colorează pentru o vreme? Tare.
executed. And people should not mistake this for weakness. Russians like this. They like the fact that Putin said, all right, enough's enough. You're not going to be
Enough is enough. Gata, ajunge.
executed. If in fact this had been different, if this had been a real coup attempt, which it was not, if this had been a genuine uprising, which it was not, then the Russian people would expect total annihilation of the enemy. But they know this is not the case. So is this business as usual? No. But it's an important event, and I think the entire Russian population will now look for that determined offensive that they've waited so long for to see an end of this war and an end to Zelensky. Now, there's something else that needs to be brought up. Zelensky has talked in recent days and weeks about effectively destroying or attempting to destroy the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant.
Ok.
Now, most of the reactors there have been essentially shut down.
Așa e.
But he keeps pushing for this. And there is a real fear on the Russian side that he may try to do damage there, release radiation, effectively creating the equivalent of a dirty bomb, try to blame it on the Russians, which
Evident. Putin e de vină. Putin did it.
people like Graham and Blumenthal and Blinken and the rest of the gang will all stand up and say, see, these Russians did it. Just imagine, you've got these very foolish men in the Senate, Blumenthal and Graham, sponsoring legislation that would trigger an immediate nuclear exchange with Russia if something like this were to happen. You have Prigozhin and Russian generals watching this, saying this is terrible. So what's your solution? End the war. Attack. Get this over with. The longer it drags on, the greater the potential for this kind of false flag that could lead to a major war. I think that too is in the back of his mind and in the backs of the minds of many senior Russian officers.
And so at the end of the day, when you look at this map, you look at this weekend's activities, and the New York Times admitting that they didn't exploit any kind of opening, a weakness on the side of the Russians. In fact, Russians fired over 50 missiles at multiple targets this weekend and weakening other positions. So it didn't appear that there was any weakness to exploit. What does Ukraine do from here? I mean, we see Zelensky now going to call up any active male, any male of able-bodied that will serve. They'll be pulled into the meat grinder. This is like a last gasp here.
Oh, I think you've summed it up beautifully. It is a last gasp for Zelensky and his crew and the various people that support him. He hasn't got much rope left, because once this offensive begins and rolls up the rest of eastern Ukraine, I also expect the Russians to cross the Dnieper and go down and seize Odessa. Now, at that point, there may be a pause.
Mai e mult până la Odessa, dar în fine.
And I think Putin will look to the West. I think he's hopeful that the Germans will find a new government. Right now, I think Scholz's position in the polls is below 30% approval.
Deci e și o latură politică a războiului, politică externă, adică Putin își dă seama că poziția europenilor devine tot mai nepopulară în rândul populației vis-a-vis de liderii europeni și așteaptă ca alegerile care vor avea loc succesiv în diverse țări din Europa, să aducă la putere niște lideri care să nu mai fie atât de implicați în slava, hai să donăm, hai să ajutăm, hai să finanțăm, hai să prelungim războiul.
Under normal circumstances, I think they'd have already had a no confidence vote. I think he hopes that will happen. I don't know what the situation is in France, but every time I talk to my friends there, they talk about Macron as though he's about as popular as the plague. And then finally you have London. And the most important feature of London is this false news and false narrative that continues to be disseminated in Great Britain, particularly in England, to turn people against Russia. But even there, that narrative is wearing thin, and people are beginning to wonder, why are we doing this?
Se fâse. Rusofobia se fâse încet în toată Europa.
This makes sense, especially when you look at the state of the armed forces in all three of those countries, France, Britain, and Germany. What are they going to do? Well, the answer is not much. And then finally, there's Poland. And I think the polls
Aici e cu slava pe putere, da? Cu fanatism. Numai că
indicate that the Polish population is now no longer enthusiastic about becoming part of a war with Russia. So,
da, fanatism până când începe să te doară pe tine, nu?
Putin wants to exercise restraint, he wants to be patient, he wants these
Vrea să exercite reținere, vrea să fie răbdător. Subtitrarea, vai, mamai.
things to happen. In other words, he wants to give time for things to develop.
Thank you so much, Colonel. Great to see you as always, and we will keep our eye on this developing story. Thanks, Colonel.
Mi-a plăcut, sper că v-a plăcut și vouă. Dacă v-a plăcut, nu uitați de like, abonați-vă, nu fiți chitre, da? Și ne auzim la comentarii, dar nu înainte de a mulțumi celor care mă susțin ca membri ai canalului Noaptea Minții și pe Patreon. Aveți linkurile în descriere. Haide, pa, pa!